He looked through her like she was made of glass. To Damian Cross, the billionaire scion of New York's elite, she wasn't a person. She was just a tray carrier, a phantom in a black uniform. But arrogance has a way of blinding powerful men. He thought he could insult her in a dead language, confident that his mockery was safe among his Ivy League friends. He was wrong. When the quiet waitress turned and dismantled his ego with a single, perfect sentence in classical Latin, the silence in the room was deafening. This isn't just a romance, it's a story of karma, hidden identities, and the moment the invisible girl finally made the world see her. You won't believe what happens next. The air inside the Obsidian Club always smelled the same: chilled ozone, vintage leather, and the metallic tang of money that was too old to be spent. It was the most exclusive private members' club in Manhattan, a fortress of limestone and arrogance located just off Fifth Avenue. For Tessa Reynolds, it was just a paycheck. She adjusted the collar of her stiff black uniform, keeping her head down as she navigated the crowded lounge. Her instructions were simple: be invisible. The Obsidian didn't hire waitresses, they hired shadows. Service was expected to be seamless, silent, and entirely devoid of personality. 2 fingers of the Macallan 46, a voice barked to her left. Tessa didn't flinch. She placed the crystal tumbler on the mahogany table with the precision of a surgeon, not spilling a drop. "Of course, sir." She moved away before the patron could acknowledge her. He didn't, of course. Men like that didn't acknowledge the help unless the drink was wrong. Tessa was 24, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. 3 years ago, she had been the youngest doctoral candidate in the classics department at Yale, a prodigy analyzing Cicero and translating obscure texts that hadn't been touched in centuries. She had a scholarship, a future, and a life. Then came the crash. Not the stock market, but her father's construction firm. A hostile takeover by a massive conglomerate had buried her family in litigation and debt. Her father had a stroke from the stress. The medical bills wiped out everything else. Tessa left Yale in the middle of the night, packing her books into boxes she couldn't afford to ship. Now, the girl who could debate the stoicism of Seneca in the original text was serving scotch to men who thought carpe diem was just a slogan for a yacht. "He's here." A whisper rippled through the staff line. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It became sharper, hungrier. The double doors swung open and Damian Cross walked in. He was the kind of man who sucked the oxygen out of a room just by existing. Tall, with shoulders that strained the fabric of a $5,000 bespoke suit, Damian was the crown prince of New York real estate. At 32, he was ruthless, brilliant, and notoriously cold. His jawline looked like it had been cut from granite, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, dark, gray, and utterly unimpressed. He wasn't alone. Trailing him was his usual entourage of sycophants and social climbers. On his arm was Vivienne Kensington, a model-turned-influencer whose family owned half of the Hamptons. She wore a dress that cost more than Tessa's entire student loan debt. "Damian, darling, over here," Vivienne chirped, guiding him to the VIP corner booth, the one with the view of the skyline. Tessa felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. That was her section. She took a breath, steeling herself. "Just do the job. You are a ghost. You are nothing." She approached the table with her tray. The group was already loud, laughing at a joke Damian hadn't even smiled at. He sat in the center, looking bored, swirling his drink as if he wished he were anywhere else. "Champagne," Vivienne ordered without looking at Tessa. "The Krug closed Bonnet, and bring the caviar service. The real one, not whatever you serve the tourists." "Immediately, ma'am," Tessa murmured. As she turned to leave, Damian's voice cut through the noise. It was a deep baritone, smooth but laced with a boredom that bordered on cruelty. He was speaking to a man across from him, a nervous-looking banker named Arthur. "Arthur, honestly," Damien said, leaning back, "your proposal was pedestrian. It lacked vision. It reminds me of the fable of the donkey and the lyre." Arthur laughed nervously. "I'm not familiar, Damien." Damien smirked, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. He switched languages, slipping effortlessly into Latin. It was a power move, a way to exclude Arthur, to show dominance. "Asinus ad lyrum," Damien drawled, his pronunciation impeccable. "Ineptus laborat, sed nil proficit, vulgus vult decipi." The table erupted in laughter. They didn't understand the Latin, but they knew Damien was mocking Arthur, and that was enough. Vivian giggled, running a hand down Damien's arm. "Oh, you're so bad when you speak French, Damien." It wasn't French. Tessa froze. Her back was to them, her hand gripping the empty tray. The donkey at the lyre. The incompetent man labors but achieves nothing. The crowd wants to be deceived. It was a bastardized quote, a mix of Erasmian adages and cynical Roman politics. But it was the arrogance that stung her. It was the assumption that he could speak the language of scholars in a room full of people he deemed beneath him, using it as a weapon to humiliate a friend. Tessa knew she should keep walking. She knew she needed this job. Her father's physical therapy bills were due on Thursday. But 3 years of silence suddenly felt like a physical weight she could no longer carry. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of men like Damien Cross thinking they owned the intellectual high ground just because they owned the building. She turned around. The noise at the table didn't stop immediately. They were too busy drinking their own importance. Tessa walked back to the table, her face calm, her posture changing. She was no longer the hunched waitress. She stood with the spine of a woman who had defended a dissertation before a panel of critical academics. She stopped directly in front of Damien. The conversation died down, not because she spoke, but because she was standing too close. It was a breach of protocol. "Did you forget something?" Vivian snapped, glaring at Tessa. "We're waiting for the champagne." Tessa ignored her. She looked straight into Damien Cross's storm-grey eyes. For the first time all night, he really looked at her. He saw a messy bun of chestnut hair, a face scrubbed free of makeup, and eyes that burned with a fierce, amber intelligence. "It wasn't Erasmus," Tessa said softly. Damien blinked, genuinely surprised. "Excuse me?" "The quote," Tessa said, her voice gaining strength, carrying over the low hum of the jazz music. "You were paraphrasing Erasmus's Adagia, specifically the section on the donkey and the lyre. But you combined it with a later medieval proverb about the deception of the masses." The table went deadly silent. Arthur's mouth hung open. Vivian looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Damien slowly set his glass down. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. He leaned forward, studying her like a biological specimen that had just started speaking. "And?" Damien challenged, his voice dropping an octave. "Do you have a critique on my syntax, or are you just here to refill the nuts?" The insult was sharp, designed to put her back in her place. Tessa didn't flinch. She took a breath and switched languages. "Barba non facit philosophum," she said clearly, her Latin pronunciation shocking in its purity. Classical, distinct, with the hard consonants of the ancient orators. "The beard does not make the philosopher." Damien's eyes widened slightly. She wasn't done. She held his gaze and continued, the dead language flowing off her tongue like water. "Tu crediste esse supra vulgus, sed arrogantia tua te cecat. Divitiae non sunt signum sapientiae, sunt tantum ornamenta." You believe yourself to be above the common crowd, but your arrogance blinds you. Riches are not a sign of wisdom. They are only decorations. For 5 seconds, no one breathed. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The other patrons in the club were turning to watch, sensing the shift in energy. Vivian broke the silence with a shrill laugh. What is she doing? Is she speaking Spanish? Damien, get her fired. Damien didn't look at Vivian. He couldn't take his eyes off Tessa. He looked electrified. For a man who had seen everything and bought everything, he was looking at something he couldn't explain. A waitress in a polyester uniform who spoke Latin better than his old professors at Harvard. "Who are you?" Damien whispered, ignoring his friends. Tessa felt the adrenaline crash. The reality of what she had just done washed over her. She had just insulted a billionaire who was likely a major shareholder in the company that owned this club. "I'm nobody," Tessa said, the fire in her voice dimming back to professional detachment. "Just the help." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Wait," Damien called out. She didn't wait. She pushed through the kitchen doors, past the startled sous chef, and kept walking. She didn't stop at the locker room. She grabbed her coat, not even bothering to clock out. She knew she was fired anyway. You didn't embarrass a VIP like Damien Cross and keep your job. She burst out the back exit into the rainy alleyway of Manhattan, gasping for air. She had just thrown away her livelihood for a moment of pride. Stupid, she berated herself. Stupid, stupid, stupid. But as she walked quickly toward the subway, pulling her thin coat tight against the wind, a black SUV rolled slowly out of the club's private garage. Inside the car, Damien Cross watched the solitary figure hurrying down the street. He pulled out his phone. "Get me the manager of the Obsidian," he said to his driver. "Now." "To have the girl fired, sir?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "No," Damien said, watching Tessa disappear around the corner. A small, fascinated smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile he had worn in months. To find out her name. The next morning, Tessa woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was the landlord. She let it go to voicemail. She knew what he was going to say. Rent was late, again. She sat on the edge of her bed in the tiny, cramped apartment in Queens. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbor's television blaring the morning news. The room was stacked high with books, her only real possessions. Heavy tomes on Roman history, Greek philosophy, and archaeological journals. They were the remnants of the life she used to have. She needed a job. Today. She made coffee that tasted like mud and opened her laptop. She spent 3 hours applying to catering companies, bookstores, and administrative temp agencies. But her resume was a mess. A dazzling academic record that stopped abruptly 3 years ago, followed by a string of service jobs. It confused recruiters. They either thought she was overqualified and would leave, or that something was wrong with her for dropping out of Yale. At noon, her phone rang again. An unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, expecting a bill collector. "Is this Tessa Reynolds?" A woman's voice. Crisp, professional, terrifyingly polite. "Yes." "Miss Reynolds, my name is Chloe Vance. I'm the executive assistant to Damien Cross." Tessa nearly dropped the phone. The blood drained from her face. "Look, if this is about last night, I quit. You can't fire me, I already left. I'm sorry about the—" "Mr. Cross isn't calling to complain," the woman interrupted. "He would like to offer you a job." Tessa paused. "A job? What kind of job? Does he need someone to translate insults for his next dinner party?" There was a pause on the other end. "Mr. Cross is looking for a private archivist for his personal library at the Cross Estate in Hudson Valley. He acquired the estate recently, and it came with a collection of rare manuscripts that need cataloguing and translation. He specifically requested you." Tessa's mind raced. An archivist. It was the job she had dreamed of when she was 19. To be paid to handle rare books, to smell the dust of history. "Why me?" Tessa asked suspiciously. "He doesn't know me." "Mr. Cross was impressed by your linguistic skills," Chloe said. "The salary is $100,000 a year, plus room and board at the estate. It is a 6-month contract. 100,000. It was enough to pay off her father's medical debt. It was enough to stabilize everything." "There's a catch," Tessa said. "There has to be. The catch is that the estate is isolated, and Mr. Cross is difficult. He has gone through 3 archivists in 2 months. They couldn't handle his standards, or his temper." Tessa looked around her tiny apartment. She looked at the eviction notice sitting on her counter. She thought of her father, sitting in the state-funded care home that smelled like bleach and despair. "When do I start?" 2 days later. The Cross estate was not a house. It was a Gothic monstrosity of stone and iron, perched on a cliff overlooking the Hudson River. The iron gates groaned as the car passed through. Tessa sat in the back of the town car, clutching her small suitcase. She was led into the house by a severe-looking housekeeper named Mrs. Higgins. The interior was vast, cold, and beautiful, filled with art that belonged in museums. "Mr. Cross is in the library," Mrs. Higgins said, pointing to a massive set of double oak doors. "He does not like to be kept waiting." Tessa took a deep breath, smoothed her simple grey skirt, and pushed the doors open. The library was magnificent. 2 stories high, lined floor to ceiling with books, a rolling ladder, and a massive fireplace where a fire crackled. The smell of old paper and leather hit her, comforting and familiar. Damien Cross stood by the window, looking out at the grey river. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, looking less like a corporate shark and more like the lord of a dark manor. He turned as she entered. "You came," he said. No hello, no pleasantries. "The salary was persuasive," Tessa replied, refusing to look intimidated. She walked further into the room. "And I assumed you wanted someone who knows the difference between Erasmus and a fortune cookie." Damien's lip twitched. "Sharp tongue. I hope your translation skills are just as sharp." He walked over to a long table in the center of the room. It was covered in rotting leather books, loose parchments, and scrolls. "This," Damien said, gesturing to the pile, "is the Blackwood collection. I bought the house to get it. It supposedly contains the private journals of a 17th-century alchemist who was exiled from Rome. It's written in a cipher that shifts between vulgar Latin and encoded Greek." He picked up a fragile, yellowed page and held it out to her. 3 experts from the Met have looked at this. They said it was gibberish. Prove them wrong. It was a test. Another test. Tessa stepped forward. She didn't look at Damien. She looked at the page. She traced the ink with her eyes, her brain instantly shifting gears. She recognized the syntax. It wasn't just Latin. It was a coded variation used by the Jesuit scholars during the Counter-Reformation to hide heretical texts. "It's not gibberish," she murmured, forgetting Damien was there. "It's a mirror cipher. You have to read the syntax backward, every second word." She looked up at him. "Do you have a pencil?" Damien handed her a silver pen. She grabbed a scrap of paper and began to scribble. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the scratching of the pen and the crackle of the fire. Damien watched her, leaning against the desk, his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at the book. He was watching the way her brow furrowed, the way she chewed her lip when she hit a difficult phrase. "Done," she said, dropping the pen. She handed him the paper. Damien read it. "The truth lies not in the gold we seek, but in the silence we fear. The king is dead. Long live the shadow." He looked up at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. It wasn't the look of a billionaire looking at an employee. It was the look of a starving man seeing a feast. "You're hired," he said quietly. "Officially." "Good," Tessa said, backing away slightly. "Now, if you'll show me to my room, I have work to do." "One more thing, Tessa," Damien said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded intimate, dangerous. "Yes." "My fiancée, Vivienne. She will be visiting often. She doesn't like you. She thinks you're a threat." "I'm a waitress turned librarian," Tessa said dryly. "I'm hardly a threat to a Hampton socialite." Damien took a step closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of rain and sandalwood. "You are smarter than she is. You are more interesting than she is. And you are the only person in 5 years who has looked me in the eye and told me the truth." His voice dropped to a whisper. "To Vivian, that makes you the most dangerous woman in the world." Tessa swallowed hard. She realized then that this wasn't just a job. She had walked into a lion's den. "I'm just here for the books, Mr. Cross." "We'll see," Damien said. "We'll see." The first month at the Cross estate passed in a blur of dust, ink, and tension that felt like a stretched rubber band waiting to snap. Tessa fell into a rhythm. She worked from dawn until dusk in the library, cataloguing the Blackwood collection. It was grueling work. The alchemist who wrote the journals wasn't just a scientist. He was a spy for the Vatican, and his journals were filled with political secrets disguised as chemical formulas. But the hardest part wasn't the Latin. It was Damien. He was there every night. After his days of conference calls and corporate acquisitions, he would retreat to the library. He told her it was to supervise his investment, but they both knew that was a lie. He came for the quiet. He came to watch her work. One rainy Tuesday, late in the evening, the air in the library was thick with the scent of wood smoke. Tessa was perched on top of a ladder, struggling to decipher a faded marginalia in a 16th century copy of the Aeneid. "You're squinting." Damien's voice drifted up from the armchair by the fire. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and a tablet in the other, which he had been ignoring for an hour. "The ink is faded," Tessa replied without looking down, and the scribe had terrible handwriting. "I think he was drunk." "Come down," Damien commanded. "It's late. You've been up there for 4 hours." Tessa hesitated, then climbed down the ladder. As her feet hit the floor, she stumbled slightly from exhaustion. Damien was there instantly, his hand catching her elbow to steady her. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through the room that was far more dangerous than the storm outside. He didn't let go. He looked down at her, his grey eyes searching her face. "You work as if you're running out of time, Tessa." "I am," she said, pulling her arm back gently. "I have a 6-month contract. And my father. The bills don't stop." Damien frowned. He knew about the debt. He had run a background check, obviously, but he didn't know the emotional weight of it. "Tell me about him. Your father." Tessa walked over to the table, organizing her notes to avoid his gaze. "He was a builder. A good one. He built honest houses for honest people. He didn't care about being rich. He cared about foundations. He used to say, 'If the bones are good, the house will stand.'" She paused, her voice tightening. Then a conglomerate swooped in. They leveraged a hostile buyout, stripped the assets, and liquidated the pension fund. They destroyed 40 years of work in 4 weeks. He had a stroke the day the bankruptcy was finalized. Damien went still. The corporate world she was describing was his world. He was one of the sharks who swam in those waters. "It's just business," Damien said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "It's never just business," Tessa shot back, her amber eyes flashing. "To the people in the ivory towers, it's lines on a spreadsheet. To the people on the ground, it's their lives. It's the difference between dignity and despair." For a moment, the billionaire and the waitress stood on opposite sides of a philosophical canyon. Before Damien could respond, the heavy oak doors banged open. "Damien! My God, this house is a mausoleum!" Vivian Kensington swept into the room, bringing with her a gust of cold air and the cloying scent of expensive, synthetic perfume. She was dressed in white furs, looking like an ice queen who had come to claim her territory. She stopped dead when she saw Tessa. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "Oh," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venom. "The help is still here? I thought archivists worked in the basement." "Tessa is translating the Blackwood journals, Vivian," Damien said, his tone cooling instantly. "And she works where the books are." Vivian walked over to the table, picking up a fragile piece of parchment with her manicured nails. Tessa flinched, wanting to snatch it back. "It looks like trash," Vivian sneered, tossing it back down carelessly. "Damien, Daddy is flying in tomorrow for the merger talks. He expects the engagement party to be settled. We need to discuss the guest list. Now." She looked at Tessa pointedly. "Can you leave? Or do you need a bell to dismiss you?" Tessa felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She looked at Damien, waiting for him to defend her, to tell Vivian to have respect. But Damien looked at Vivian, and a mask slid over his face. The mask of the CEO. The merger. The Kensington deal was crucial for his company's expansion into Europe. He needed Vivian's father. "Leave us, Tessa," Damien said, his voice flat. Tessa felt like she had been slapped. Just moments ago, there had been a connection, a spark of understanding. Now, she was just an employee again. "Of course, sir," Tessa whispered. She gathered her things and walked out, feeling Vivian's smirk burning into her back. As the doors closed, she heard Vivian laugh. "Really, Damien, she dresses like a librarian from the 1950s. It's embarrassing to have her in the main house." Tessa walked to her room, her hands shaking. She wasn't angry at Vivian. She expected cruelty from her. She was angry at Damien. She was angry that for a second she had let herself believe he was different. But she didn't pack her bags. She couldn't. She needed the money. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was poisonous. Vivian had moved in for the week. She treated the estate like her personal kingdom, and Tessa like an unwanted stain on the carpet. "My diamond earrings," Vivian screeched from the hallway around noon. "They're gone! I left them on the library table last night." Tessa was in the library, cataloguing. Her stomach dropped. Damien and Vivian stormed in, followed by Mrs. Higgins. "She took them!" Vivian pointed a shaking finger at Tessa. "She was the only one in here after we left. I took them off because they were heavy, and now they're gone. Search her room." "Vivian, stop," Damien said, rubbing his temples. "Tessa didn't take your earrings." "How do you know?" Vivian shrieked. "She's broke. She's a desperate waitress with a mountain of debt. Of course she took them." Tessa stood up, her dignity wrapping around her like armor. "I did not touch your jewelry. I have no interest in your things." "Liar!" Vivian lunged for Tessa's work bag, dumping it upside down on the table. Pens, notebooks, and a laptop clattered out. And then, tumbling from the side pocket, a pair of diamond drop earrings. The silence was absolute. Tessa stared at the diamonds, horror washing over her. "I didn't put those there. She must have planted them." Vivian gasped, a theatrical performance worthy of an Oscar. "You thief! Damien, call the police! I want her arrested! I want her in jail!" Damien looked at the earrings. Then he looked at Tessa. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she held her head high. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. He looked at Vivian. He saw the gleam of triumph in her eyes. It was too perfect, too staged. "No," Damien said. "What?" Vivian snapped. "I said no." Damien's voice was like ice. "Tessa didn't steal them. They were in her bag." "Because you put them there," Damien said calmly. "I saw you in the hallway this morning, Vivian. You were carrying them. You slipped into the library while Tessa was at breakfast." Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a fish. "You're choosing her word over mine, over your fiancé." "I'm choosing logic," Damien said. "Tessa is translating a collection worth $20 million. If she wanted to steal, she would steal a manuscript, not your mass-produced diamonds. Get out. You can't talk to me like that. My father—" "I don't care about your father right now," Damien roared, his temper finally snapping. "Get out." Vivian fled the room, sobbing in rage. Tessa stood trembling by the table. Damien walked over to her. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough to shield her from the door. "I didn't see her put them there," Damien admitted softly. "I lied." Tessa looked up at him, shocked. "Then why did you defend me?" Damien looked down at her, his expression intense and unreadable. "Because barba non facit philosophum. A beard doesn't make a philosopher, and diamonds don't make a lady. I know who you are, Tessa, and I know who she is." 2 weeks later, the Cross estate was transformed. It was the night of the Midsummer Solstice Gala, an annual charity masquerade that drew the elite of New York, London, and Paris. The gardens were strung with thousands of fairy lights, a string quartet played on the terrace, and champagne flowed like water. For Tessa, it was a nightmare. Vivian had returned, bringing her father, Marcus Kensington, the CEO of Kensington Enterprises. Because of the earring incident, Vivian had demanded that Tessa be kept out of sight during the party. But at the last minute, 2 catering staff called in sick. Vivian, with a cruel smile, had suggested the solution. Why not have the archivist help? She used to be a waitress, didn't she? It's what she's good at. So, while the guests arrived in couture gowns and Venetian masks, Tessa was back in a black uniform, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. It was humiliating. But Tessa Reynolds was made of steel. She pinned her hair back, put on a simple black domino mask that covered her eyes, and went to work. Just survive the night, she told herself. Tomorrow, you go back to the books. She moved through the crowd, invisible once again. She heard snippets of conversation, gossip about affairs, stock tips, and political maneuvering. She made her way to the library, which had been turned into a VIP smoking lounge. She needed to collect empty glasses. As she entered, she saw a group of older men huddled by the fireplace, smoking cigars. In the center was Marcus Kensington, Vivian's father. He was a large man with a red face and a loud, booming voice. Tessa froze. She recognized that voice. She had heard it on the news 3 years ago, announcing the acquisition of her father's company. She backed into the shadows of a bookshelf, clutching her tray. "The merger is practically done," Marcus was saying, puffing on his cigar. "Damien is a smart boy, but he's distracted. Once we sign the papers next week, Kensington Enterprises absorbs Cross Holdings' construction division. We'll strip it down just like we did with that Reynolds outfit a few years back." Tessa's breath hitched. Reynolds. "That was a messy one," another man chuckled. "Didn't the owner have a stroke?" "Old man Reynolds?" Marcus laughed. It was a cold, heartless sound. He was soft. He refused to cut corners on safety materials, cost him his margins. We bought the debt, forced the foreclosure, and sold his equipment for parts. Made a cool 40 million in profit. Cross is tougher, but once he marries Vivian, I'll have him on a leash. The tray slipped from Tessa's hands. Crash. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the library like a gunshot. The men turned. Marcus Kensington squinted through the smoke. Clumsy girl. Clean that up. Tessa didn't move. She couldn't breathe. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a random tragedy. It wasn't market forces. It was him. Vivian's father. He had deliberately destroyed her father for profit. He had orchestrated the debt, the pressure, the stroke. He was a monster. And Damien was about to marry the daughter of the monster. Damien was about to merge his company with the man who killed her family's future. I said, clean it up, Marcus barked. Tessa looked down at the broken glass. Then she looked up. Her eyes, behind the black mask, were burning with a cold, terrifying fire. She didn't clean it up. She turned and ran. She ran out of the library, through the ballroom, weaving through the dancers. She needed air. She needed to think. She burst out onto the terrace, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. Tessa! She spun around. Damien was there. He was wearing a tuxedo and a silver half-mask, looking like a dark prince. He had followed her. What happened? He stepped closer, concern etching his features. I saw you running. Did someone hurt you? Get away from me, she choked out, backing away toward the stone balustrade. Tessa, talk to me. He reached out to take her hand. Do you know? She demanded, her voice shaking. Do you know what Marcus Kensington does? Damien paused, confused. He's a shark, Tessa. We all are. What did he do? He destroyed my father, Tessa screamed, the sound tearing out of her throat. He's the one. Reynolds Construction. He bought the debt and stripped it. He laughed about it, Damien. He laughed about my father having a stroke. Damien went completely still, the color drained from his face, under the mask. And you? Tessa's voice broke into a sob. You're marrying into that family. You're merging with him. You're just like him. No, Damien said firmly, stepping forward and grabbing her shoulders. I am not him. Then prove it, she cried, pushing against his chest. Prove that you aren't just another rich man who treats people like disposable parts. Let me go, Damien. I can't be here. I can't look at you. She broke free from his grip and ran down the stone steps into the dark gardens. Damien stood alone on the terrace, the music of the waltz drifting out from the ballroom. He looked at his hands. He looked back at the library where Marcus Kensington was smoking his cigars, planning to dismantle Damien's life, just like he had dismantled Tessa's. Damien Cross had spent his whole life building a fortress around his heart. He thought power was about money. He thought success was about control. But as he watched Tessa disappear into the night, he realized he had been wrong. He ripped the silver mask off his face and threw it onto the ground. It shattered. He turned and walked back into the ballroom. He wasn't going to the library. He was going to the stage. The music stopped as Damien climbed onto the platform where the orchestra was playing. He grabbed the microphone. The room went silent. Hundreds of masked faces turned toward him. Vivian was in the front row, smiling, expecting a toast to their engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, Damien said, his voice booming through the speakers. There has been a change of plans. He looked directly at Marcus Kensington. There will be no merger, Damien announced, his voice cold and deadly. And there will be no engagement. The crowd gasped. Vivian dropped her champagne glass. Get out of my house, Damien said to the Kensingtons. All of you. He dropped the microphone and walked off the stage, ignoring the chaos erupting behind him. He had just started a war, and he needed his general. He needed Tessa. The morning after the gala, the Cross estate was a fortress under siege. It wasn't arrows or battering rams at the gates. It was news vans. The breaking news chyron on every channel read, "Billionaire Damien Cross cancels wedding, declares corporate war." Inside the library, the mood was funereal. Damien sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, surrounded by a team of 5 high-priced lawyers who looked terrified. "It's a bloodbath, Damien," his chief counsel, a man named Sterling, said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Marcus Kensington isn't just suing for breach of promise. He's dumping his shares in Cross Holdings. He's triggering the immediate repayment clauses on your construction loans. He's going to bankrupt you within 48 hours. Damien stared at the phone in the center of the table. He looked exhausted. He hadn't slept. He had chosen his conscience over his capital, and now the bill was due. "Let him try," Damien said, though his voice was rough. "I'd rather be broke than married to his daughter." "You won't just be broke," Sterling warned. "You'll be destitute. You'll lose the company. You'll lose this estate. You'll lose everything." Tessa stood in the corner of the room, invisible as always. She held a tray of coffee, her heart aching as she watched Damien being torn apart. It was her fault. If she hadn't spoken up on the terrace, he would be safe. He would be marrying into billions. Now he was going down with the ship because he had defended her honor. She set the coffee down and quietly slipped away to the far end of the library, back to her pile of ancient books. It felt trivial to be translating Latin while the modern world burned, but it was the only thing she knew how to do. She opened the final volume of the Blackwood collection, the Journal of Mercy. She began to read the dense, coded script. The alchemist, Blackwood, was writing about his exile. He had been the treasurer for a corrupt cardinal. He wrote about how the cardinal had hidden stolen gold. "To hide the mountain," the text read in Latin, "one must not dig a hole. One must build a second mountain of lies." Tessa frowned. She translated the next line. "The scales are balanced not by weight, but by the shadow of the weight. Create a ghost ledger, where the debts appear as assets, and the assets vanish like smoke." Tessa stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this method. It wasn't just alchemy, it was forensic accounting. Blackwood was describing a primitive but brilliant form of mirror trading, creating false transactions to inflate value while hiding insolvency. Her mind flashed to what Marcus Kensington had said in the smoking room. "We stripped the assets, made a cool 40 million. If Marcus was as arrogant as the cardinal in the story, he wouldn't just use brute force. He would use the same trick. He would be hiding the debts of his own failing empire by stripping healthy companies like her father's, and now Damien's. "Damien," Tessa said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the lawyer's shouting. Damien looked up, his eyes softening when they landed on her. "Tessa, you don't have to stay for this. Go to your room where it's quiet." "I need the Kensington financial reports," she said, stepping into the light. "The public filings for the last 5 years. Sterling scoffed. "The girl wants to play accountant. Listen, honey, we have forensic auditors. Give them to her," Damien ordered. "Damien, be serious." I said, "Give them to her." Damien slammed his hand on the table. Sterling threw a heavy binder across the mahogany surface. Tessa grabbed it. She opened it next to the 17th century journal. She placed her finger on the ancient cipher and her other finger on the modern spreadsheet. She began to work. For 3 hours the room was silent. The lawyers whispered, checking their watches, convinced Damien had lost his mind. Damien just watched Tessa. He watched the way her eyes darted back and forth, the fierce intelligence that burned in her amber gaze. "Here," Tessa whispered. She grabbed a red pen and circled a series of numbers in the Kensington report. Then she circled a paragraph in the Latin text. "What is it?" Damien asked, coming to stand behind her. "It's the ghost ledger," Tessa said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Look at this column. These are consulting fees paid to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They match exactly, to the cent, the depreciation write-offs in his construction division." She looked up at Damien. "Marcus isn't rich, Damien. He's broke. He's been broke for a decade. He's running a Ponzi scheme. He buys companies like my father's, strips the cash to pay the interest on his own loans, and then hides the debt in these shell companies. He needs your merger not to expand, but to survive. If he doesn't get your liquidity by the end of the month, his entire empire collapses." Sterling leaned in, looking at the numbers. His face went pale. "My God, the math. She's right. It's a fractal pattern. It's illegal. It's massive fraud." Damien looked at the binder. Then he looked at Tessa. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "He tried to bury you," Damien whispered to her, "and you just dug his grave." The storm outside had broken, leaving the sky a bruised purple. At 4:00 p.m., a convoy of black SUVs tore up the driveway of the Cross estate. Marcus Kensington slammed his car door and marched up the steps, followed by Vivian and a phalanx of aggressive litigators. Marcus looked like a bull ready to charge. He burst into the library without knocking. "You're done, Cross!" Marcus bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "My lawyers just filed the injunction. We're freezing your assets. You'll be begging on the street by Monday." Vivian stood beside him, looking smug. "You should have stuck with me, Damien. Now you lose everything." "And for what?" "For her." She gestured vaguely at the room, assuming Tessa was hiding. Damien was sitting by the fire, swirling a glass of scotch. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. "Hello, Marcus." "Vivian?" Damien said smoothly. "Please sit down. We were just discussing history." "I'm not here to chat," Marcus spat. "Sign the merger agreement now, and I might let you keep the house. Refuse, and I bury you." "History is fascinating," Damien continued, ignoring the threat. "Specifically the history of the Asinus ad lirum, the donkey at the lyre." "What the hell are you talking about?" "I believe," a clear, strong voice rang out from the shadows. "He is talking about you." Tessa stepped out from behind the towering bookshelf. She wasn't wearing her uniform. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that Damien had bought for her that morning. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in waves. She looked regal. She looked dangerous. Vivian scoffed. "The waitress speaks." Tessa walked to the table and picked up the heavy binder. She threw it down in front of Marcus. It landed with a heavy thud. "I translated the Blackwood Journal," Tessa said, her voice steady. "But then I decided to translate your 10K filings. It turns out the language of thieves hasn't changed much in 400 years. Marcus looked at the binder. He saw the red circles. He saw the diagram connecting his shell companies. His face went from red to a terrifying shade of grey. "This is nonsense," Marcus stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "It's felony fraud," Damien said, standing up. "Racketeering, embezzlement. And thanks to Tessa, we have the map. We traced the Cayman accounts, Marcus. My team has already sent the file to the SEC and the FBI. They should be arriving. Oh, right about now." As if on cue, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder with every second. Vivian looked at her father. "Daddy, what are they talking about?" Marcus sank into a chair, all the air leaving his body. The bully was gone. The Titan was gone. All that was left was an old, frightened man who had been caught. You destroyed my father, Tessa said, stepping closer to him. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy with judgment. You broke him for profit. You thought you were untouchable because you had money. But as the Romans said, she leaned down, looking him in the eye. Falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. The front doors burst open. Federal agents swarmed the hallway. Marcus Kensington, an agent shouted, you are under arrest. As they dragged Marcus away, he looked back at Damien. You ruined me for a waitress, he screamed. Damien wrapped an arm around Tessa's waist, pulling her close. No, Marcus, I didn't ruin you. She did. Vivienne stood alone in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face, her social status evaporating instantly. She looked at Damien, then at Tessa. She didn't say a word. She just turned and ran, chasing after the police cars. The library fell silent. The sirens faded. Damien turned to Tessa. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, trembling intensity. You saved me, Damien said. You saved the company. You saved the estate. I just read the books, Tessa said softly. It's what I do. Damien shook his head. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. No. You saw the truth when everyone else saw what they wanted to see. You are the most brilliant woman I have ever met. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. I don't want an archivist, Tessa. I don't want an employee. What do you want? She whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. I want the partner who stands beside me when the world is burning, Damien said. I want the woman who answers back in Latin. I want you. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite kiss. It was acclaiming. It was passionate and deep, filled with the relief of survival and the promise of a future. Tessa melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. For the first time in 3 years, the weight on her shoulders was gone. She wasn't the girl with the debt. She wasn't the invisible waitress. She was seen. She was loved. 6 months later, the debt was paid, all of it. Tessa's father was in a private rehabilitation center, regaining his speech and his mobility. The doctors said he would walk again by Christmas. Tessa sat in the garden of the Cross estate, a rare first edition of Ovid in her lap. The sun was setting over the Hudson, painting the water in gold. Damien walked out onto the terrace, 2 glasses of wine in his hand. He sat beside her, handing her a glass. The board approved the new foundation, Damien said, kissing her temple. The Reynolds Scholarship for Classical Studies. Full tuition for 20 students a year. Tessa smiled, tears pricking her eyes. Thank you. Damien looked at her, his love for her as evident as the sunset. Amor vincit omnia, he quoted softly. Tessa laughed, clinking her glass against his. Love conquers all. See? Damien grinned. I'm learning. She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the river flow. The waitress and the billionaire. It sounded like a fable, a story someone would tell to pass the time. But it was real. And as Tessa looked at the man who held her hand, she knew their story was just beginning. And that is the incredible story of Tessa and Damien. It proves that true power isn't about the money in your bank account, but the brilliance of your mind and the strength of your character. Marcus Kensington thought he could crush the weak, but he forgot that the sharpest weapon in the world is the truth. Tessa went from being an invisible waitress to the woman who brought down an empire, all because she refused to let her voice be silenced. If you enjoyed this story of justice, romance, and sweet revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. What did you think of Tessa's revenge? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.